It was late when my husband, Jason, was driving our family home from a weekend getaway. The kids were asleep in the back seat, and I could tell Jason was exhausted. We were 2 hours from home, and Jason had been driving since early that morning. He was getting impatient with a car going too slow, and after a brief moment of frustration, he passed it aggressively. As soon as he pulled in front of the car, the driver started tailgating us, getting closer and closer. Jason tried to shake him off, but no matter what, the car stayed right on our bumper. I could feel my anxiety building. We didn't want him to know where we lived, so Jason decided to take an exit early to lose him. We took several turns, hoping to throw him off, but the car followed every twist and turn, staying right behind us. My heart was racing as Jason grew more frustrated. After a few more attempts to shake him, we finally headed toward Jason's office, a place with a security guard. I thought it would be safe there. As we pulled into the parking lot, the car followed us in. Jason jumped out of the car and headed for the building, telling me to stay in the car with the kids. But the man wasn't finished. He got out of his vehicle and walked straight toward Jason. My heart stopped. I was about to get out when I saw the security guard coming outside, quickly walking toward the confrontation. "Hey!" the guard shouted. "What's going on here?" The man turned to face him, agitated. "I'm just talking to this guy. He passed me on the highway and I'm telling him what I think about it." "You need to leave," the guard demanded, stepping closer. "I'll call the cops if you don't." After a tense moment, the man mumbled under his breath and returned to his car. Jason hurried back to the vehicle, pale but unscathed. "We're leaving," Jason said urgently. We drove off as quickly as we could, with the guard watching us until we were out of sight. The man didn't follow, but the fear lingered in the air. When we finally got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something worse. Jason and I didn't speak much about it that night, but we both knew we'd never forget the close call. We couldn't help but wonder what had driven that man to follow us for so long, and why he had been so determined to confront Jason. Was it just a simple case of road rage, or was there something more to it? I don't know who that guy was, but I pray we never run into him again. Every time we drive at night now, the memory of that man's car following us sticks with us, a chilling reminder of how quickly things can go from ordinary to terrifying. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. My wife, 2 kids, and I were heading upstate to visit relatives, taking the scenic route to enjoy the countryside. It was a long drive, but we were used to it. What should have been a fun getaway soon turned into a terrifying experience. We decided to take a back road to save time. The further we went, the more isolated it became. The sun was setting, casting an eerie glow over the trees. Rachel glanced at me, a look of concern in her eyes. "Are you sure this is the right road?" she asked. "Yeah," I replied. But the feeling of being watched began creeping in. As we drove deeper into the woods, I saw them. A group of men standing off to the side of the road, waving their arms frantically, asking for help. Something about the way they stood unsettled me. They didn't look like people in need. They looked like they were waiting for us. One man approached the car. "Our truck broke down just up the road. Can you give us a ride into town?" I hesitated but decided to help. I unlocked the door, and the man climbed in. The other men walked alongside the car, keeping pace with us. I tried to make conversation, but the man beside me didn't say much. Instead, he stared straight ahead, a strange smile forming on his lips. "Where exactly is your truck?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then in a chilling voice, he said, "It's just up ahead, but we've been waiting for you." I froze, my stomach sinking. Before I could react, one of the men slammed his hand against the back window. I jerked the wheel, speeding up, but they kept pace, getting closer. My heart raced as I glanced at the rearview mirror, seeing one of them running beside the car, his eyes wild. I pushed the car harder, the engine roaring, but it felt like they were gaining on us. A loud bang echoed through the car as something scraped against the side. I swerved around a curve, but one of the men reached for the door handle. I slammed the gas pedal, desperate to get away, and finally I saw a gas station up ahead. We didn't stop until we reached safety. I told the clerk about the men, but he just stared at me saying, "There's no one out there. Folks don't use that road much anymore." I knew what I saw. Those men were still out there, waiting, and I couldn't shake the feeling they were following us. I've driven across states countless times for work. Most of the time I fly, but when I have to deliver equipment or vehicles, I volunteer to make the drive. On one of those trips, I was driving a big box truck filled with equipment from another office. The plan was to head out early, but a delay in loading pushed my departure to the late afternoon. I knew I'd be hitting traffic, so I decided to wait a bit longer until after rush hour. By the time I was driving through rural areas in the middle of the night, I was already feeling exhausted. I stopped at a rest stop north of the state line to fuel up and grab some coffee. The place was empty, well lit, and quiet. It was around 1 a.m. and I figured it'd be a good time to stretch my legs. As I was walking back to my truck, I noticed a pickup parked next to mine. A guy was standing by the truck making small talk. Then he asked if I was having any mechanical problems with my vehicle. I thought that was a strange question. I hadn't mentioned anything was wrong with the truck. I shrugged it off, got back in, and kept going. The next stretch of road was dark and isolated, surrounded by thick woods. Just as I was crossing a bridge, all of the truck's lights went out. Headlights, dashboard lights, brake lights, everything. I tapped the brake to see if the brake lights worked, but they didn't. For a second, I thought I was just tired and imagining things. But then in frustration, I slammed my fist on the dashboard, and suddenly everything came back on. It was strange, but I just kept driving, hoping it wouldn't happen again. A few miles later, I reached a gas station. I noticed that same pickup truck had pulled in after me. The guy wasn't going to the pumps, though, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I filled up, I saw a cop car pull in. I waved him over, mentioned the truck, and asked about the road conditions. The officer didn't seem concerned and left pretty quickly. I had a bad feeling, so I decided to stop for the night. I found a motel a few miles away and locked up my truck. I kept glancing around, feeling like I was being watched. I barely slept that night, keeping an eye on the parking lot through the curtains. By morning, I couldn't wait to get back on the road. When I finally made it to the office, I had the truck checked by a mechanic. They didn't find anything wrong. The lights never went out again. But I'll never forget the way I felt that night. It was like something was wrong, and I couldn't shake that feeling of being followed. Maybe it was all just my mind playing tricks, but I've always wondered if that guy at the rest stop had something to do with it. I was driving through the Canadian Rockies late at night, heading back home after a trip, when I passed through a small town. The highway was dark, empty, and I was on the road for what felt like hours without seeing another car. It was the kind of silence you only get in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but trees and the occasional flicker of distant lights from tiny towns. At one point, I realized I needed to stop, but I had already missed the last rest stop. No big deal. The road was deserted and I figured I could just pull over. So I parked on the side, stepped out to pee, and lit up a cigarette while I stood there, staring into the dark. The air was cold and the silence was almost overwhelming. Then I saw something move. At first, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me, or maybe a deer wandering out of the trees. But no, this was definitely a man. He was walking slowly, coming out of the woods, and I froze. I wasn't exactly panicking, but I definitely wasn't calm either. I mean, I was miles from anywhere. There was no one else around, and my phone barely had a signal. I backed up toward the car, trying not to make a sound. My heart was racing, and I could feel my palms starting to sweat. I climbed back into the driver's seat and locked the door, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. He wasn't rushing toward me, just strolling along, but something about it felt off. It's like he wasn't in any hurry to go anywhere, just walking down the road as if he belonged there, in the middle of nowhere, at 3 a.m. I sat there for what felt like forever, the engine off, just watching him. My mind was racing. Should I drive off? Was he harmless? What was he doing out here? But I didn't want to make a move until I was sure. After what felt like an eternity, I finally turned the engine on, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I couldn't stay there any longer. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing. No sign of him. I breathed a little easier, but the unease didn't go away. I drove for a while, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The road was so quiet, so empty. Every time I looked in the mirror, I half expected to see headlights or a figure walking behind me, but the highway stayed empty. A couple of hours later, I reached a small town and stopped at a gas station to refuel. As I was paying, I overheard two locals talking about weird sightings along that stretch of highway. One of them mentioned a guy who had been seen walking around on the roads late at night, just showing up out of nowhere. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't stick around long. I paid quickly, got back in the car, and drove the rest of the way with my eyes on the road, not daring to look back. I never drove that route again. There are just some roads you don't want to be on after dark. Some places are better left unexplored. It was around 2 a.m. when I was driving alone on a dark highway, heading back from a long trip. I was tired, but I just wanted to get home. The road was empty, and it was pitch black outside, except for my headlights cutting through the darkness. I had been on this road before, but tonight felt different. The road seemed endless, and the silence was heavy, like the whole world was asleep, and I was the only one awake. I turned a corner, and that's when I saw him. A man standing on the side of the road. At first, I thought maybe it was just a shadow, but no, he was really there. I slowed down, my heart starting to beat faster. Who would be out here this late? As I got closer, I could see him more clearly. He was tall, his clothes ripped up, but the worst part was his eyes. They looked empty, like he wasn't even real. I couldn't stop looking at him. I kept driving, telling myself I was just tired, imagining things. I tried to shake it off. I told myself to keep going, just get home, but I couldn't stop feeling like something was wrong. I looked back in my mirror, hoping to see another car, but there was no one. The man was still standing there, and then I saw him move. He started running after my car. I freaked out and hit the gas, my heart racing. I wasn't about to find out what he wanted. I kept looking in my rearview mirror, but I didn't see him anymore. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was close. A few miles later, I saw headlights in my mirror. A car was speeding up behind me, way too fast. I pushed the pedal harder, but no matter what I did, the car stayed right behind me. The headlights in my mirror were blinding, and I could barely see. Then the car swerved and pulled up next to me. I saw the driver. His skin was pale, his eyes wide open, and that creepy grin on his face. It wasn't a normal smile. It was twisted. It made my stomach turn. He yelled, "Go ahead." "It's too late. You've already seen too much." I didn't know what he meant, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I slammed on the gas again, desperate to get away. The car behind me swerved and crashed into a tree. The sound of the crash was so loud, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I just kept driving as fast as I could, looking in my rearview mirror, expecting to see him right behind me. But there was nothing. When I finally made it home, I was shaking. I haven't driven that road again. I don't know who that guy was or what he wanted, but I know I'm not going back there. Some things are better left in the dark.